Hi, it's Jonathan Schwab. I host Jewish History Nerds with my friend Yael Steiner.
We're back. Every week, we nerd out on a fascinating topic from Jewish history. We're not historians, but we are fired up about learning. On Jewish History Nerds, we share our passion for Jewish history with each other and with you.
This season, we're exploring some of the most famous Jewish thinkers and intellectuals in history. You probably know their names, but we'll tell you their stories from their early days, and we'll get to know their backgrounds and beliefs. And as always, we have rich and captivating stories from Jewish history that you've probably never heard of. So join us for new episodes every Thursday. I promise you'll learn something new.
Subscribe to Jewish History Nerds wherever you get your podcasts. And now you can watch our videos on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and search for Unpacked Podcasts. Whoever said history was boring clearly never heard these stories.
Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and this is Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This episode of Unpacking Israeli History is generously sponsored by Deborah and Avi Nader and Jody and Ari Storch. To sponsor an episode of Unpacking Israeli History, or just to say what's up, be in touch at noam@unpacked.media. Okay, before we start, as always, check us out on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, all the places. Just search Unpacking Israeli History and make sure to hit that follow or subscribe button and, 5-star rating. It's so nice when you do that. It's so nice. Okay, yalla, let's do this.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
We, the people of Israel, are prepared and anxious to meet the representatives of our neighbors without any preconditions.
There are people in Israel and elsewhere say it's impossible to make peace between the Arabs and Israel or the Jewish people. I think they are wrong.
Welcome back to our 5-part journey across the centuries, exploring why Jews have remained so connected to the land of Israel. Right? That's a relevant question for all of us that's really interested in the story and history of Israel. And last week, we explored the reawakening of spiritual Zionism all over the world as medieval poets and hilltop mystics and ordinary, humble Jews dreamed of Jerusalem. Some Jews actually made the difficult journey towards the dusty land that had once been the crown jewel of the Levant. Others funded these expeditions, eager to see Zion rebuilt. Most Jews, however, they merely prayed and they hoped Jerusalem no more concrete to them than a dream. But the world was changing. In the 18th century, Enlightenment ideas began to knock down ghetto walls. Emancipation raised questions. Nationalism suggested answers. Anti-Semitism took on new forms. An ancient dream collided with modern upheavals, eventually resulting in a state. It was messy. It was that word that I can't stand that I say so often. It was complicated. And it is where this episode begins. Chapter 1, Free at Last, maybe. If humanity had been fumbling in the dark for centuries, the Enlightenment claimed to flip the switch. For much of Europe's history, power rested with church and crown. Ordinary people weren't meant to question authority, expect rights, or imagine alternatives. The Enlightenment challenged all of that. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Locke argued that human beings were born with inherent rights that governments had an obligation to protect. That was the job. More radical still, they suggested those governments should be accountable to the people that they ruled. Today, that seems obvious, and maybe you're thinking maybe that's not so obvious with the government that you live in or what you feel about that government. This idea, a couple hundred years ago, it was explosive. These ideas, they didn't just reform European society, they destabilized it. Revolutions followed, most famously in France, where thousands died in pursuit of liberty, equality, and fraternity. For Jews, this new world was both thrilling and disorienting. Freedom and equality were not simple gifts, especially for people who had spent centuries on the margins of European society. So let's rewind to the late 18th century, to 1791. France became the first country to grant Jews full civic equality. Slowly, much of Western and Central Europe followed after the French. After centuries of persecution, Jews were emancipated, freed from legal discrimination, and granted citizenship. They now enjoyed possibilities their grandparents could not have possibly imagined, including suffrage, voting, access to universities, and a role in public life. But emancipation came with strings attached. Before fully emancipating French Jews, Napoleon posed a blunt set of questions to Jewish leaders. Were Jews allowed to intermarry? Did they see non-Jewish Frenchmen as brothers? Would Jews born in France consider themselves French, fight for France, obey its laws? The question underneath all of it was simple, and it was quite familiar. Think of it in the context of today. Could Jews be loyal citizens of the countries they lived in, or were they forever a people apart? Their hearts always turned towards Jerusalem. The rabbis who answered Napoleon's questions knew they were walking a tightrope. Emancipation meant equality, but it also meant expectations. In exchange for full citizenship, Jews were asked to become less conspicuously Jewish. Instead of being Jews first and only, they would now be Frenchmen or Germans who just happened to practice a particular faith, a particular religion. For many Jews in Western and Central Europe, this seemed like a fair trade. From that tension emerged a distinctly Jewish version of the Enlightenment, known as the Haskalah, from the Hebrew word sechel. Its champions, the Maskilim, they believed Judaism was fully compatible with reason, with logic, and modern European culture. Shed that superstition stuff, which meant that Jews didn't need to abandon Judaism. They needed to refine it, get secular educations, integrate, step out of the ghetto, and enter the wider world. But the Haskalah wasn't just a surface makeover. In his epic book about Moses Mendelssohn in the Jewish Live series, historian Shmuel Feiner writes that at its core, the movement was an existential wager. Europe would accept the Jew if the Jew just changed, made himself a little less, Jewy. As Judah Leib Gordon, a leading poet of the 19th century Haskalah, put it, be a man in the street and a Jew at home. That means that to gain acceptance in the public life, in the public square, let's say, Jews had to confine their Jewish identity to the private sphere. Well, that often created a divided and a fragile sense of self. But plenty of Jews signed on. They hoped that this was the end of the blood libel, of legalized discrimination, of social isolation, and their neighbors' disgust. They felt they were making a decent gamble. They would put their kippot in the home and the synagogues, and that's a very easy wager if it meant ending anti-Semitism. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Who saw that coming? The more Jews integrated, the more their neighbors resented them, because integration didn't make Jews disappear. It just made them visible as competitors, economically and culturally. The Enlightenment overhauled cultural norms, including anti-Semitism. Religion was out, science was in, and anti-Semitism got a makeover for the 19th century. Hating Jews for their religion was so passé. Hating Jews for their inherent racial inferiority, though, that's just good science. I wish I were joking, but I'm not. Race science recast Jews as inherently and unchangeably inferior, and no loyalty oath or baptismal font could wash away that kind of stain. Nerd corner alert. We owe the word anti-Semitism to exactly this kind of pseudo-scientific racism. In 1879, journalist Wilhelm Marr decided that the German word for Jew hate, Judenhass, was too old-timey because it emphasized religion. But he was a man of science. He didn't hate Jews because they prayed funny or killed Jesus. He hated Jews because they were racially inferior. So he repackaged a very old hatred under a new name, anti-Semitism. Marr either didn't know or didn't care that Semitic is a class of languages, not people. Hebrew is a Semitic language, but it isn't spoken by Semites because technically there is no such thing as a Semite. But anti-Semitism just sounded so modern and scientific. And so we owe Marr not just for the new name, but for the fact that to this very day, some profoundly annoying people claim they can't be anti-Semitic because they're Semites themselves. Guys, this is not a clever argument. Okay, but I digress. If emancipation felt like a promise, the Dreyfus Affair shattered it completely. By 1894, French Jews had been citizens for over a century. They served in the army. They participated in public life. They believed they belonged, and it felt so good. It feels good to belong. And yet, when scandal erupted in the French army, suspicion immediately landed on a Jewish officer, Captain Alfred Dreyfus. Actual evidence? Come on, don't let details get in the way. It didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, the evidence was that Dreyfus was a Jew. And here's the way public opinion works. The facts often don't matter at all. It's what public opinion says. Accused of treason, Dreyfus was publicly humiliated, stripped of rank, and condemned as a traitor as crowds screamed, "Death to the Jew." Throughout the ordeal, he maintained his innocence and loyalty, shouting, "Vive la France!" How was that for my horrific? Could we AI change that?
Vive la France.
Long live France, even as his country turned on him. Among the screaming mob was a young Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl. Within a few years, he would convene the first Zionist Congress. The Jose Hamadina, the person who was the envisioner of the state. Within a few decades, the Jewish people would have that state. But we'll get there. Hold your horses. Meanwhile, to the east, Jewish life looked very different. Forget accusations of dual loyalty. Forget accusations of treason. The peasants of the Russian Empire had a more direct way of dealing with undesirables. Pogrom after pogrom, meaning state-sanctioned violence, ripped through the Jewish communities of Poland and Ukraine, killing tens of thousands. Again, this is one of those things that people forget. They're like, the Holocaust, horrible. Yeah, Holocaust, horrible. But pogrom is also really bad. Really bad. As historian Anita Shapiro put it, the violence was a clear message. You are forever strangers in a strange land. And so while Jews in Paris and Berlin put their faith in Enlightenment ideals, the Jews of Eastern Europe looked to the heavens instead. In the 18th century, a mystic, an amazing Jewish leader known as the Baal Shem Tov, sparked a spiritual revolution among the poorest and most battered Jews of the region. He taught that God could be found not only in books and scholarly debates, but in reality, in songs, in stories, in joy, in everyday life. This movement became known as Chassidut, or Hasidism. That's not a word I know how to say well. I call it Hasidus. Hasidus, as in Williamsburg, as in so many of us have so much of this inside of us without even knowing that we're part of this movement. But a conversation for another time. The Baal Shem Tov was the anti-elitist. He emphasized that what's in your heart matters in a way that is just as important as what's in your head. His movement was both mystical and is accessible. It taught that anyone could cultivate an intimate relationship with God. Anyone. That in fact, God didn't demand strict rationality and asceticism, but joy. Ordinary Jews fell in love with Chassidut, with Hasidus. The scholarly elite, for the first 50 to 70 years, they didn't. But here's what's critically important, especially for this series. The connection with the land of Israel. That's what this series is about. Both the Hasidim and their fiercest critics, the so-called mitnagdim, the misnagdim, the opposers. By the way, that's not what they went by. That's just what they were called after the fact. They shared some spiritual DNA with their Kabbalistic forebears in the 16th century land of Israel, Safed, Tzfat, including their deep longing for redemption and for the land of Israel. It was Rebbe Nachman in the 1798 to 1800, I believe, was right around, where he went to Israel. And he said it actually transformed his life. He went through so much to get to Israel. The time he spent in Israel transformed his life. And then when he returned, he brought that back to Eastern Europe. And he said this line, "B'chol makom shani holech, ani holech l'Eretz Yisrael." Wherever I go to the land of Israel. It was that trip to the land of Israel that shaped so much of his teachings. And for some misnagdim, for the opponents from mitnagdim, that longing translated into action. If redemption demanded a rigorous adherence to Jewish law, well, where better to live out those ideals than the Holy Land? Through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, small groups of elite scholars made their way to Jerusalem and Tzfat with the full encouragement of their leader, the Vilna Gaon, Elijah Kramer, also known as the Gra. Hasidim and mitnagdim were theological enemies in the first 75 years of the creation of Hasidut. A third group of Jews brought them, if not together, then at least to the same side. Many Enlightenment Jews, or maskilim, had been born into observant families, but they turned away from the yeshiva and towards the university. They championed secular learning, reason, and full integration into European society. But they were still Jews, so they put a Jewish spin on Enlightenment ideas, immersing themselves in Jewish texts and Hebrew literature. As the cradle of Jewish civilization, the land of Israel figured prominently in their scholarship. But the land of Israel was Jewish history. Berlin, Vienna, the great cities of Europe, those were the Jewish future. Zion mattered, but Zion could be remade and renewed right here. Got all that? Yeah, I know it's a lot. Let's review. There were three major Jewish groups in Europe and later in the land of Israel during the 18th and 19th centuries. Hasidim trusted God. Mitnagdim trusted discipline and study. And Maskilim trusted reason and progress. Now, you listening, you might be like, don't break that down like that. It's more complicated, to which I will say, I agree. I know, but it's not bad for shorthand. They disagreed fiercely about almost everything, conceptualizing their Jewish identity in very distinct ways. But deep down, they were all striving towards Zion, dreaming of a world in which the Jewish people could at last fulfill their purpose without the violent interference of their neighbors. Together, they set the stage for a new question, one that rejected both total integration and total withdrawal from the secular world. What if the answer wasn't fitting in or praying harder, returning home? Chapter 2, Homeward Bound. As we've seen over the past few episodes, political Zionism didn't appear out of nowhere. It was rooted in centuries of Jewish ritual, of poetry, and longing for Zion. It just needed a modern frame. Enter this new concept, nationalism. Nationalism. As various ethnic groups began organizing around their shared language, land, and identity, some Jews began to rethink exile not as a spiritual condition to be endured, but as a political problem with a political solution. One of the first to make that leap was Moses Hess, a German Jewish philosopher and one-time comrade of Karl Marx. Where Marx rejected both nationalism and Judaism, Hess championed both. In 1862, he published Rome and Jerusalem, which argued that Judaism wasn't merely a religion, but a national identity. And that meant that, like all other nations, the Jewish people deserved sovereignty and self-rule. Hess imagined a Jewish return to Zion as a moral project, not merely a desperate insurance policy for people trying to avoid being murdered by their neighbors. His vision of a Jewish society built on justice, cooperative labor, and spiritual renewal would one day be called labor Zionism. Hess's ideas didn't land with most of Western Europe's wealthy, integrated Jews. Leave the salons and cafes of Paris and Berlin to rebuild a long-lost Jewish commonwealth in a swampy backwater in the middle of nowhere? Get real. But a generation later, well, a wealthy, assimilated, educated young journalist reached the exact same conclusion as Hess. And yes, now we're going to come back to Herzl. Theodor Herzl was the model of a fully emancipated Jew. And yet he read the writing on the wall. In Der Judenstaat, he warned that emancipation and integration had failed. Catastrophe was coming for the Jews of Europe, which meant Jewish sovereignty was not some distant ideal, but a necessity for any Jew who wanted to survive the 20th century. But not every early Zionist was preaching doom and gloom. Some, like Echad Ha'am, focused on the importance of a Jewish cultural revival. These cultural Zionists, as they came to be known, envisioned a Jewish spiritual renaissance in the land of Israel, a renewal of the Hebrew language, Jewish scholarship, Jewish culture. Unlike Herzl, who pictured a Jewish state more or less indistinguishable from other Western European countries, Echad Ha'am's dreamed of a community, not necessarily even a state, that would remind the world what being Jewish actually meant. In fact, his love of the Jewish nation inspired his pen name, Echad Ha'am, which literally means one of the people. His birth name was Asher Ginsburg. The debate between Herzl and Echad Ha'am was pretty simple. Herzl was trying to save the Jews. Echad Ha'am was trying to save Judaism. Mostly, though, these highfalutin visions didn't convince Jews to become Zionists. Most became Zionists for the simple reason that they didn't want to die on the business end of a Cossack's bayonet. In 1882, the Russian Jewish physician Leon Pinsker argued that Jews would never be accepted in Europe. Again, this is before Herzl. The days of pleading for tolerance were over. The only solution was to build Jewish power. In his pamphlet, Emancipation, he wrote, and here's a quote, "To the living, the Jew is a corpse. To the native, a foreigner. To the homesteader, a vagrant. To the proprietary, a beggar. To the poor, an exploiter and a millionaire. To the patriot, a man without a country, for all a hated rival." In 2,000 years, nothing had changed. That's what he learned. It was time to try something different. It was time for the Jewish people to emancipate themselves, not by begging for scraps, but by taking control of their own destinies. But innovation is hard. Imagination is hard. I hate to quote the anti-Semite Henry Ford, but this possibly apocryphal line is just too good. Quote, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. In other words, true innovation doesn't come from just improving an old model, but from finding the chutzpah to envision a different model entirely. When all you know are horses, it's hard to imagine a car until someone shows you a whole new world. Sure, anti-Semitism was a problem, but many of the Jews of Europe were stuck in the old model. They simply couldn't imagine a new solution. They were imagining a faster horse. And the ones on offer, finding liberation by going backwards 2,000 years, neither appealing nor convincing. Make the trek to Ottoman Palestine to scratch out a living in a backwater choked with dust and malarial swamps? No thanks. No. They'd create solutions right here, where they already lived. Yes, like I said, their horse was slow. That didn't mean they couldn't find a faster one. So instead of turning to Zionism, most of Europe's 9 to 10 million Jews pursued other paths towards acceptance. If roughly 1 to 3% were Zionists, another 5 to 10% turned to socialism. Still a minority among Jews, but a bigger one than the crazy Zionists. In 1897, as Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress, a group of socialist Jews issued their rebuttal. They formed the General Jewish Labor Bund, which championed Doigkeit, here-ness. Okay? Instead of distracting himself with a pipe dream a million miles away, they would fight for justice in the here and now. And justice meant workers' rights, Jewish cultural autonomy, and a thriving diaspora Judaism. Tragically, history had other plans. Plans that Herzl, that prophet of disaster, could see from a mile away, even if others could not. Chapter 3, the Herzl story. History may be punctuated by tragedy, but it's also got a sense of irony. Of all the early Zionists we've discussed so far, Herzl was perhaps the least likely to coalesce these crazy ideas into an effective political movement. Born in 1860 into a wealthy, secular Jewish family, Herzl grew up with all the promises of emancipation. He had a first-rate education, non-Jewish friends, he was cool, and an ironclad conviction that anti-Semitism was a quirk of the past. But he could admit when he was wrong. Maybe you've learned that Herzl was radicalized by the Dreyfus Affair, horrified by the Parisian mob shouting, "Death to the Jew," and I just spoke about it just a couple minutes ago. It's a good story, one that Herzl himself played up for dramatic effect, but it's probably not entirely the case. Not entirely. As friend of the pod and my friend, Chaviv Retek Gor, Israeli journalist, he's pointed out that Herzl already encountered Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, and exclusion during his college years, despite his eagerness to assimilate, to just be, one of the guys. He was so devoted to the idea of integration that he even proposed that all Jews convert to Christianity en masse. That was his solution to anti-Semitism. So some people say that they hear that and they're like, oh my God, he really wasn't even that Jewish. No, that's not the reaction. The reaction was Jew hatred and anti-Semitism was so bad that his only solution was that Jews should stop being Jewish. Well, it didn't work because Jews wanted to stay Jewish. And he realized that it didn't matter what the Jews did or didn't do. Anti-Semitism always finds a way to justify itself no matter what. Hey, remember the Marranos? Remember the Conversos? Remember them? They were hated also, by the way. Jews are just too different. Or they're not told that, they're just felt that. They're told they don't want to fit in. They're communists. No, they're not communists. They're the opposite of communists. They're capitalists. No. They're globalists. No. They're rootless cosmopolitans. Whatever you don't like, that's what they are. Pick your century. Pick your flavor of anti-Semitism. It doesn't need to make sense. It is outside of Jewish behavior, a virus in the mind of the anti-Semite. And if anti-Semitism always infect the great liberation movements, as Herzl suspected, then the Jew had only one option. One option. Self-rule. So Herzl didn't pick up the sword. He picked up something else. He picked up the pen. In 1896, he wrote Der Judenstaat, what I said earlier, the Jewish state or the Jewish state, depending on your translation, arguing that wherever Jews lived in large numbers, anti-Semitism would follow. It's not going away. It's not going away. And he believed, and he was so wrong, Sorry. But he believed that unless they had their own state, Jews would remain trapped in an endless cycle of toleration, resentment, and persecution, that anti-Semitism would vanish. He imagined a Jewish state that was modern, secular, and orderly with all the accoutrements of a normal country. Trains, parliaments, embassies, guys in suits making laws, both a refuge and an escape from our role as history's perpetual unwelcome guest. Well, a year later, he convened the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Jews gathered not to pray for redemption, but to plan it. The Congress had a single goal: establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured under public law. That was the goal. Privately, Herzl was even bolder. In his diary, he wrote, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be met with laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50, everyone will recognize it." Wow. He was right. 50 years later. This is real. 50 years later, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine. One Arab state, one Jewish state. 6 months after that, Israel declared independence. But back to Herzl. Not everyone appreciated his vision. Many rabbis criticized his movement for preempting divine redemption, picking apart his godless form of Judaism. As the scholar Yehuda Mirsky puts it in his book, which is amazing, also put out by the Jewish Live series, amazing series, Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution, many traditional Jewish leaders believed, quote, "The utterly deracinated and assimilated Viennese journalist was as far as one could possibly imagine from the traditional image of the Messiah." And meanwhile, cultural Zionists like Achad Ha'am, they believed that Herzl's model lacked cultural and spiritual substance. And even the survivalists were split. Once Herzl introduced his so-called Uganda plan. What's the Uganda plan? I'll tell you. In 1903, after a devastating wave of pogroms, including the notorious massacre in Kishinev, Herzl floated a controversial idea. Controversial isn't strong enough. Devastating idea to many. Palestine was the ultimate goal. They knew that. That was the land of Israel. Palestine is the land of Israel. But could a temporary refuge elsewhere save lives in the meantime? When the British offered territory in East Africa, Herzl brought the proposal to the Sixth Zionist Congress. The reaction was explosive. The motion passed, it did, but it nearly ripped the movement apart. Many delegates simply walked out in protest, including the Russian Jews, and they were the ones who faced the worst violence. Not that it mattered, the Brits quickly rescinded the offer, and 2 years later, the Seventh Zionist Congress rejected the proposal outright. Still, the question lingered. Could Zionism exist without Zion? Chapter 4, Zionism without Zion? For centuries, Jewish longing had been fixed on Zion. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the land of Israel was small, underdeveloped, and poor. A profoundly unlikely site for the modern Jewish revival. But what if the Jews established their Zion elsewhere? A new Jerusalem for a new century. A small minority, the territorialists, broke away from the Zionist movement, arguing that safety mattered more than geography. They proposed alternatives all over the map. They proposed places like Argentina, Siberia, Cyprus, even Texas, and of course, East Africa, inspired by Herzl himself. The movement's most prominent voice and founder was the British writer Israel Zangwill, who established the Jewish Territorialist Organization in 1905. His argument was blunt and pragmatic. Forget history. Forget sentiment. Jews just needed somewhere safe to go. It was a utilitarian position, utterly pragmatic. It was also extremely unpopular because it turned out that Zion wasn't interchangeable. The land of Israel wasn't just a piece of territory. It was the center of Jewish memory, of ritual and identity. A Jewish national movement without Zion wasn't really a national movement at all. It was exile relocated. By the way, others have tried and failed to make territorialism happen, including Stalin. We can't get into it now, but check out the show notes on the Jewish Autonomous Oblast in Birobidzhan. It's remarkable. It's not super shocking that Stalin's little experiment failed, considering how he felt about Jews. Not good if you're wondering. But even if Stalin had loved us, Zionism just doesn't work without, Zion. And historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi helps explain why. He distinguishes between history, which is analytical or observable, and memory, which is sacred and identity forming. Zionism was not merely a response to persecution, but a product of thousands of years of collective memory. Jews had been looking towards Jerusalem since 586 BCE, and they weren't going to change direction now, no matter how spacious or convenient Texas or Uganda or Bijan might be. In some ways, though, the debate between the territorialists and the traditionalists hasn't gone away. It's just been reframed, asking, is Israel a Jewish state or simply a state where Jews live? And what is the difference? But for many Jews, such questions were and are beside the point. Till now, we've told the well-worn story of political Zionism. But not all Zionism was political. For some Jews, it was lived, a fact of life as obvious as breathing. The flavor of Zionism rarely gets the attention it deserves. It isn't showy or dramatic. It had no congresses, no delegates, no political power. But it was Zionism all the same, so deeply entwined with Jewish life in some parts of the world that it didn't need a name. In Baghdad and Casablanca, Salonika and Shiraz, and Jerusalem and Hebron, a different flavor of Zionism had always animated Jewish life. Chapter 5, another side of the story. So far, we've discussed almost every type of Zionism, paying special attention to the strands developed and tested in the European marketplace of ideas. But as Herzl was writing and Pitzker was warning, Jews elsewhere had their own relationship to Zion, and it was far from theoretical. For simplicity, I'm going to refer to the Jews of Southwest Asia and North Africa as Sephardic and Mizrahi. Even though these terms are imprecise, they're overlapping, and in the case of Mizrahi, it's anachronistic. The terms are just more familiar and less annoying than Southwest Asian and North African Jews. Regardless of what we call them, these Jews did not see Zion as a metaphor or an abstraction, as something merely symbolic or spiritual, but a physical address. They had relatives in the ancient Jewish cities of Jerusalem, of Hebron, of Tiberia, Tiberias, and Tzfat, which had long been home to communities from Aleppo, Baghdad, Fez, Ishmir, and beyond. And their connection to the land was practical, familial, devotional, and continuous. Decades before Herzl was born, Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai, a Sephardic rabbi from Sarajevo, called for a return to Zion as both a fulfillment of prophecy and a practical necessity. In his 1834 book, Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, both a prayer and a directive, he advocated for Hebrew education, agricultural renewal, and even land purchases in the region known as Palestine. Alkalai's ideas were rooted not in nationalism, but in a religious vision of redemption, driven partially by human initiative. Nathan Birnbaum may have invented the term Zionism in 1890, but earlier figures championed the movement well before it had a name. Nerd Corner alert! Birnbaum eventually became allergic to the project, aligning himself with the devoutly religious anti-Zionist organization Agudat Yisrael, or Agudat Yisrael. Check out our episode on the Neturei Karta for more on Orthodox anti-Zionism. In the mid-19th century, Rabbi Dr. Yehuda Aryeh Leon Bibas, then the chief rabbi of Corfu, Greece. I think I pronounced that right, but I've never been to Corfu. So, hey, community of Corfu, Greece, if you ever want to bring me out, let me know. If I pronounced your name of the city incorrectly, Mabi. But anyway, he was advocating for a return to the land of Israel as a way to draw closer to the divine, inspired by the Jewish concept of teshuvah. Teshuvah is translated as repentance, but that's actually not what the word means. Teshuvah means return, and where some interpret the return as purely spiritual, many don't. And Rabbi Yehuda Bibas, he linked the two. How better to return to God than to come back to the land that he promised? In the last year of his life, Rabbi Bibas made his own return, settling in the city of Hebron in 1852. Of course, Rabbi Bibas was far from the only voice calling for return. In the late 19th century, entire Yemenite Jewish communities made their way to the land of Israel, driven not by political theory or European nationalism, but by their faith, their messianic faith. Hundreds walked for months across harsh terrain to reach Jerusalem. But when they arrived, they were met with suspicion. Could these dark-skinned newcomers in dusty robes really be Jews? No, decided both the Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities of the Holy Land. So, they excluded their Yemenite brothers from the established aid networks that supported Jerusalem's Jews, even barring them from living in the city. Undaunted, determined to get as close as possible to the holy city, these newcomers settled just outside Jerusalem's walls, laying the foundations for the first Jewish neighborhoods of the so-called new city of Jerusalem. It's an ugly story, but it demonstrates the very real and prominent role of Zion in the Jewish imagination. To Yemenite Jews, Jerusalem was worth any sacrifice, while the city's established Jewish communities guarded it zealously from outsiders. Eventually, all the established communities of the Holy Land, the ones who had literally never left, the ones who had returned after exile, inquisition, persecution, or pilgrimage, would be largely sidelined by a Zionist movement shaped primarily by European assumptions about culture, class, and modernity. As scholars like Ella Shohat have noted, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews often experience Zionism as both deep belonging and deep displacement. Their connection to the land was not ideological or nationalist. It was lived, religious, and inherited. They did not need to rediscover Zion because they had never left it. The modern state was built largely by secular Ashkenazi Jews. That's a fact. But modern Zionism is not purely a European project, not at all. The Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews who lived in the Holy Land for centuries were just as committed, just as rooted as their Ashkenazi brothers and sisters. And though their Zionism initially bore little resemblance to European political Zionism, their story reminds us that the Jewish connection to the land of Israel has always bolded, underlined, been layered, diverse, and continuous. That complexity neither indicts nor excuses the early Zionist establishment. Consolidating an ancient fractured people into a modern nation was always going to leave wounds. Always. And those wounds bring us to the final chapter of this episode, in which Zionism collided headfirst with the dreams and the aspirations of another nation, and a conflict that shows no sign of resolution. Chapter 6, The Roots of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1880 to 1948. Come on! You knew this was coming. The Jewish people had never been alone in the land of Israel. For centuries, the Holy Land was home to a mosaic of Muslims, Christians, Arabs, Turks, Armenians, Druze, Jews of all stripes, groups that sometimes fought and sometimes traded and often just lived quietly side by side. That reality didn't disappear when Jewish immigrants began arriving in Palestine en masse in the 1880s. The first Aliyah brought not just people, but a new national project. Or let me say it better, a renewed national project. These Jews arrived not as pilgrims or temporary residents, but as a unified movement with long-term national ambitions. And while they were careful to purchase land legally, these transactions often displaced tenant farmers without compensation. Legally, these new immigrants were in the clear. Morally, it wasn't their responsibility to compensate the tenant farmers. That was for their Arab landlords to work out. That's my take. I just gave you my opinion. But practically, these distinctions didn't really matter to the people who had just lost their homes. Let's be real. If I were them, put yourself in their shoes, I'd be resentful too. And it's far easier to resent a stranger than the semi-feudal landlord who has owned your family's land for decades. After centuries of Ottoman rule, the Arabs of Palestine hadn't quite developed the distinct Palestinian Arab nationalism. Not yet. And at first, their response to Jewish immigrations was muddled and fragmented, more a rejection of Zionism than a coherent expression of their own nationalist ambitions. But as the Ottoman Empire disintegrated and European powers rushed in, the Arabs of Palestine began cultivating their own form of nationalism, fueled by anti-colonial sentiment and fear that this new Jewish population would soon displace them entirely. And when fear collides with dueling nationalist ambitions, violence follows. The riots began in 1920, intensified with the Hebron massacre of 1929. And if anyone, Arab or Jew, maintained the delusion of peace or coexistence, the 3-year Arab revolt of the late 1930s shattered it entirely, hollowing out Palestinian society and hardening Jewish resolve. We've covered these events in depth elsewhere. What matters here is that coexistence collapsed under the weight of competing national dreams, all under the watch of the British. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, European powers rushed in to carve up its territory. To assuage the natives, they made promises they weren't prepared to keep. In a series of letters to the Sharif of Mecca between 1915 and 1916, the Brits promised to recognize an independent Arab state somewhere in the region, though they never quite clarified its boundaries. A year later, they declared their support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, and again without committing to what that might look like. When the victorious Allied powers formalized this commitment in 1920, they didn't consult with either Jews or Arabs. Though Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann was in the room, a privilege not afforded to any Arab leaders. Only the UK, France, Italy, and Japan decided the fate of the patch of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So when the Brits officially assumed responsibility over Palestine in 1922, Palestine's Arabs were understandably deeply concerned about what this meant for them. At the same time, an increasingly extreme Arab leadership repeatedly incited its population to violence, drowning out or eliminating any moderate voices. And in one of the most baffling moves in history, the Brits actually enabled this extremism by appointing local rabble-rouser Haj Amina Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a semi-made-up position that made him the most powerful non-Brit in Palestine. Throughout their brief and unsuccessful tenure as the ruling power in the Holy Land, the Brits tried to appease everyone, failing miserably. That's what happens when you try to appease everyone. Some Zionists favored working with the British. After all, they were in charge. It was only practical. But the more strictly they limited Jewish immigration, the angrier Palestine's Jews became, especially after Hitler came to power in 1933, sending Europe's Jews scrambling for any escape hatch. As the world's doors slammed shut, people forget this. The Jews were not invited to other places. They had nowhere to go. The Brits blocked the entrance to the one place that actually wanted to absorb hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees. After much debate about how to respond, the Zionist movement splintered, an ideological fissure that persists to this day. And representing the two sides of this growing disagreement were two men you've definitely heard of. Maybe, I don't know. David Ben-Gurion. On the one side, cha-ching, ba-ba, I don't know what the right noise is. David Ben-Gurion. And there he is. Head of the Jewish Agency, was relentlessly pragmatic. He worked with the Brits when they served his interests, defied them when they didn't, and never lost sight of his goal. Keep the eye on the prize. Building the institutions that would eventually form the backbone of a Jewish state. It was thanks to his persistence and pragmatism that the Yishuv built the schools, the farms, the militias, the labor unions, and all other infrastructure necessary, the boring parts for running a country, not the speeches, the things that actually make things happen. But Ben-Gurion could be ruthless. He really could. He had no qualms about publicly savaging his rivals, even turning them over to the Brits if he felt he had to. And his bitterest rival, at least at first, was the Ukrainian-born firebrand, Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Like Ben-Gurion, Jabotinsky was intimidatingly competent and effective, the kind of guy who could write a novel, organize a militia, and build an enduring ideological movement before 10 a.m. That enduring ideology was known as revisionist Zionism, a movement often described as muscular for its unapologetically assertive ethos, and also very realistic, where Ben-Gurion believed in diplomacy and slow institution building and process. Jabotinsky saw delay and delusion. His 1923 essay, The Iron Wall, which I have right next to me, you can't see, but I have it right next to me, it outlined his position. Arab opposition to Zionism wasn't some misunderstanding to be cleared up over coffee and baklava. It was rational and profoundly human because no nation co-signs its own displacement. And that meant it had to be resisted. Fiercely. Quote, the Iron Wall. Boom. Here's what he says. It may be that some individual Arabs take bribes, but that does not mean that the Arab people of Palestine as a whole will sell that fervent patriotism that they guard so jealously. Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of, quote, Palestine into, quote, the land of Israel, end quote. Nerd Corner alert, and this one is significant. It might be weird for you to hear me say the language of colonists and colonized, but A, it wasn't me speaking, it was actually Jabotinsky, and B, back in 23, those words didn't carry the same connotations that they now do. In fact, they used to be fairly neutral terms, more or less on par with immigrant. For Jabotinsky and other early Zionists, the quote-unquote colonization of Palestine merely referred to large-scale immigration and settlement of the land. It didn't require or involve a metropole, a mother country, pulling the strings and sending representatives to extract resources. It didn't involve exploitation, and it didn't involve racial hierarchies, and it didn't involve forced labor or violent missionizing like happened in actual colonialism. That's what happened in other places when they were extending the hegemony of their mothership, of the metropole. But that is not what this was at all. Anyway, Jabotinsky's wider point stood. He saw what Ben-Gurion perhaps did not want to admit. To the Arabs of Palestine, these Jewish immigrants were coming to steal their home. That's how they saw it. And that is why the Iron Wall remains so powerful. That's why it's right next to me. It's just like in a significant book. You should read it for yourself. More than a century ago, Jabotinsky saw the essential dilemma that continues to plague Palestinians and Israelis. The two populations were inherently at odds. Jews should not expect compromise or coexistence. That's what he argued, and it was only once that they established an iron wall of Jewish strength that negotiations would become possible. To his critics, Jabotinsky was a dangerous militarist. To his followers, he was brutally honest. And to us in the 21st century, he is disturbingly prescient. Jabotinsky died in 1940 without seeing the full scale of the Holocaust or the birth of the Jewish state. I feel fairly confident that if he had lived, he would have encouraged a Jewish revolt against the Brits, whose strict immigration quotas sentenced countless Jews to the Nazi inferno. And he probably would not have been thrilled with the outcome of the 1947 partition plan for Palestine, which carved up the territory into strange, jagged shapes. In fact, few Zionist leaders appreciated the UN proposal for their new borders, but they were practical. Noam Weissman, Israel's ever-pragmatic first president, and the real leader of the Zionist movement until 1946, by the way, great episode for another time about the 22nd Zionist Congress. We'll get there. We'll get there at some other time. But Chaim Weizmann, he captured the moment with his typical dry realism. We'll take what we can get and build from there. It wasn't the full dream of Zion restored, but it was international recognition of Jewish sovereignty. And that would have to do for now. But Arab leadership rejected the plan outright. They did. That's what happened. For them, partition was not compromise, but capitulation. A colonial injustice stamped with global approval. The only dignified response, the only response of honor, was war. The Arab rejection of the Jewish state forged a new kind of Zionism, erecting a scaffold of steel underneath the idealism and spiritual longing. The combination of diplomatic failures, historical trauma, geopolitical opportunity, and local resistance made Zionist ambition fierce and hungry, ready to defend itself to the death. As Palestinian scholar Rashid Khalidi observes in The Iron Cage, the Palestinians were not simply overrun, they were outmaneuvered by a movement that had spent decades, if not centuries, preparing for this moment. The Zionist project arrived at the UN vote in 1947 with political institutions, paramilitary forces, international connections, and a clear, if internally debated, sense of purpose. But their victory carries a massive cost. Despite its achievements, its iron wall, its iron dome, the state of Israel has lived on the sword for nearly a century. Meanwhile, the Palestinians have become what my friend Ahmed Fuad al-Khatib calls a nation in waiting. Eternal refugees. Their villages depopulated, their communities uprooted, their homeland lost. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of all was that none of this was inevitable. History could have shaken out differently. It just didn't. But while this tragedy can't be reversed, it might someday, somehow be rectified. But that is a story for the future. Epilogue. We have come a long way since episode 1, tracing the long, uneven path toward Jewish sovereignty. After millennia of powerlessness, the Jewish people had finally won the right to shape their own destiny. And if they survived the 1948 War of Independence, they would face the new challenge of figuring out how to wield their unfamiliar power. How do you rebuild after the Holocaust, after a genocide like that? How do you absorb millions of immigrants into a tiny and impoverished country surrounded by enemies? How do you unify dozens of diaspora communities who view Judaism differently into a single healthy national culture? How do you establish a state that is both Jewish and democratic? If these questions sound familiar, that's because many of them linger into the present day, more pressing and immediate than ever. In the next episode, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at how the early state tried to answer them. From refugee camps to absorption centers, from massive infrastructure projects to the rebirth of Hebrew culture. We will explore the tensions that defined Israel's first decades between secular and religious Jews, Ashkenazi elites and Mizrahi newcomers, Holocaust trauma and Sabra swagger. And we'll begin to trace the policies that still shape Israel today, including the aftermath of 1967 and the return to Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank, which reignited old debates with new and devastating force. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt warned, founding a state is only the beginning. The harder task is preserving its soul. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked and OpenDor Media brand. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating on Apple or Spotify. It's super helpful. It really does help other people find our show. And one more time, I love hearing from you. So email me at noam@unpacked.media. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Amir Tzemach, Adi Elbaz, and Rob Pera. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for being here. See you next week for part 4.